everyone. Today we have our another new episode, and this episode is very, very important because we work for developing world. Ukraine has a lot of challenges, a lot of problems, and we have our scholars from around the world, and they are actually supporting Ukraine. And through this model, maybe we can help more developing world, and we can solve more critical problem like where. First, I would like to give chance Professor Rob because this proposal actually come from you, and we have many friends right now in Ukraine. They need a open dialogue, open discussion, and support.
Sure. Uh, Often when we have catastrophe like this, and it is a catastrophe, the folks deal with the catastrophe is over, and then they attempt to go back to life as it was. The difficulty being, whether we're talking about climate change or war, the world has changed. And so the planning to go back to whatever it is you're going to be living needs to start before you actually have to start doing it. Otherwise, you'll simply revert. And the reason I brought this up is because as the Ukraine eventually rebuilds and has to deal with the problems that it has today, it needs to think about a new set of conceptions, a new base level of concepts, and that it has to include the security of the people. What's been clear, at least in this conflict, is that Ukraine, while it had been built around the idea of an Eastern-Western world war as it was constructed, and did have provisions inside for shelters, when you're being attacked by a neighbor over a prolonged period of time, those have clearly proven inadequate. And really, technology has come a long way since the 1940s and 50s, which is the conflicts that Ukraine was mostly constructed to deal with. So my thinking was this at first and foremost, and really it has a lot to do with dealing with the issues today, because if you're watching the news, and I imagine certainly if you're in Ukraine, the concerns with regard to citizen safety have to be predominant. And whether we're talking about food and water or just keeping them from being killed by the Russian incursion, it's not set up as a defensible structure. And if we go back to the United States during the time of the expansion in the West, what were built were defensible structures that the citizens could go to, and those structures then could hold against what was then the indigenous people of the time. So thinking through that, and suggesting that perhaps the structure we're looking for is an ecology. The concept of an ecology is a self-contained, living, working entertainment structure that is by nature defensible, where if there is an incursion or an attack, the people can be reasonably protected. It's not spread out; it's very centralized. You can set up a perimeter around it. You could certainly design it with the idea of having air defenses and ground defenses, and make sure that the water, food, and air supplies were safe for the facility. And so what I was arguing, and use technology to get there relatively quickly. 3D printed buildings could now be used because they'll go up substantially quicker, and they are arguably sturdier than many other forms of construction. They can go up both initially to handle folks that have been dehomed, that need a place to stay, and then permanently when they start rebuilding the cities and communities to make Ukraine a stronger create a stronger living environment than they currently have. So right now Ukraine needs a number of things. They need weapons. They need training for the weapons. They need clean water, they need clean food, and for the most part, for the non-combatants, they need some place where those people can go, be safe, and contribute to society. And it's that last part where they're lacking in areas that are under conflict, and that's why I'm saying that as they think through both construction during the conflict and construction post-conflict, they're going to need to consider, how are you going to defend these structures? How are you going to make sure that this does not recur? If there's another incursion, that you can protect the people, protect the food, protect the water, and keep them safe with a reasonably sized force. So you don't have to field a massive army to protect people in their homes, which isn't particularly viable. So as long as Russia remains a threat, then Ukraine needs to be redesigned to address that threat, and that does mean that it predominantly needs to focus on containing and protecting its citizens, and protecting and containing and assuring the supplies of medicine, food, water that the citizens need to be safe and healthy. And so that I'm arguing that that a holistic approach be taken to identify areas that are defensible, to build in those areas that are defensible, and to build in a way that can be defended, so that if this ever happens again, Ukraine can even be stronger in its defense, and there will be fewer issues with regard to moving ordnance around and protecting citizens.
Excellent, Professor Rob, for your excellent contributions, and I want to give thanks. And this is very typical issues right now. And yes, many people from developing world and Asia, they're also supporting the Ukraine, but we need better strategy to support Ukraine. Professor Edward, what you want to add for today's discussion? Can you unmute, please? Can you unmute? Professor Edward, yeah.
There we go. Okay, sorry. I'm coughing a bit here. Anyway, I was just saying that I, of course, concur with Rob's excellent points. And I had in 1989-90, and thereafter, I actually had been in Moscow, in the Baltics, and as well as many other countries, doing work on transitioning from some kind of a totalitarian or corporatist crony system into a free system. So I've got a little bit of experience on the ground with this. And I want to make 4 quick points here. First of all, of course, obviously we don't know what the outcome is. And so in terms of rebuilding Ukraine, it really kind of depends on what is going to happen. I mean, the ideal is that that the Russians themselves overthrow Putin, and you have a real Russian revolution to change the system, to get rid of the crony system, which unfortunately people like me who were trying to do that 20, 30 years ago were not able to convince them to do. And then maybe even have the Russians pay reparations, just like after World War II, Germany paid reparations to Jews who settled in Israel to help them resettle, because they, of course, were the cause of the Holocaust. But what I suspect is going to happen is probably Russia is going to keep part of Ukraine, Crimea, and a few other areas maybe. And hopefully, best case scenario is that the Russians and the oligarchs at least will stop Putin from trying to take the rest of it, because it's been such a hard sell. But let me make the other 3 points about rebuilding. I want to call the attention of your audience to what happened after World War II in Germany, what was called the Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle. What happened is the United States had a Marshall Plan, basically to help the war-torn countries of Europe rebuild and reestablish themselves. Germany, the UK, and others got money for this rebuilding. However, there's very interesting that even though Britain, of course, was on the winning side, they had been devastated too. But any aid that we gave them, it didn't really work, because they had a really terrible system, a very socialistic system. What happened in Germany, and especially starting in 1949, when the Germans were given more control over their country, and at least in the Western sectors, is a gentleman named Ludwig Erhard basically instituted very free market oriented policies, basically getting rid of wage and price controls, having a stable currency, and so forth. And so what you saw is this contrast in Germany after World War II, devastated country, of course. They were able to rebuild a lot faster and overcome a lot of the problems than some of the other countries, because of the approach that they took. And so that's the thing I'd say to your audience. Take a look at the Wirtschaftswunder in Germany after World War II, because they had damaged infrastructure, of course, destroyed completely infrastructure, terrible population displacements, and all of the sort of things that that Russia's Hitler, Putin, that is inflicting on Ukraine. The next point I want to make is I came up with the concept at the Heritage Foundation of an index of economic freedom, which basically looked at what policies work best to bring a country from, a very bad economy to a very good economy. And not surprisingly, you can take a look at it. It's they publish it every year. It's the economies that basically instituted more market-oriented policies with less corruption. Keep that in mind, less corruption, that have prospered. And what you saw is, of course, war-torn Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, and of course, Korea not only had World War II, but they had the Korean War, were able to finally rebuild faster, because what you see is that they had the economic liberty to do so, and they had less corrupt governments than some of the other governments around. I mean, Singapore was fairly authoritarian, but if you didn't chew gum and do certain things, you were still left to be an entrepreneur, and that's why they were able to prosper and rebuild from World War II, and of course, in the case of Korea, the Korean War. So for Ukraine, what I would say is this. Again, my experience was trying to help the people in the Baltics and in Russia as well, rebuild from after communism. The Baltics went in a free market direction. Estonia is doing very well. Russia, unfortunately, did not. I'd ask all of your listeners to take a look at Zelensky's TV show. As most of you know, before he was elected president, he was a comedian. And he did a TV series called Servant of the People. And if you have Netflix, you can go and you can watch that series. It's an incredible series. It's about him as a high school teacher who accidentally gets elected to be president of Ukraine. And most of the series is him fighting the oligarchs, him fighting the corrupt bureaucracies, the corrupt officials, and so forth. And it was based on him being a comedian doing this series that he actually got elected to be president of Ukraine. So he certainly understands that Ukraine has been a corrupt society just as much as, or corrupt government just as much as Russia has. So in terms of the rebuilding, I think there's an opportunity for Zelensky, with the help of the West, to rebuild his society, to institute more of those true free market initiatives that will allow Ukrainians to join the Czech Republics and the Estonias and the more prosperous countries that used to be part of the Soviet bloc. And here, this is important, especially, Sharif, because of the emphasis in your show on technology and exponential technology. This is an opportunity for Ukraine to say, given where technology is going, how can we structure our education system to be more of a market-based system where technology allows us to teach and train children better than the normal sage on the stage approach, to look at how you can use this technology to start building your economy, not from scratch, obviously, but to overcome a lot of the problems that they have. So this is, in a sense, an opportunity. If they can hold off the Russians, and of course, they're going to get aid from the West, for things like infrastructure and so on. They really have an opportunity to revolutionize their society by getting rid of the corporatist or crony system and using the exponential technology to empower their entrepreneurs to deliver the kind of services that we all talk about on this program so often. I'll probably just sign off soon because my voice is going, but this is a very important topic, and I really want to congratulate you, Sharif and Rob, because I think you were the one who came up with the idea. Thanks for this.
Thank you. Take rest, Professor Edward. Take rest. Mr. Marshall.
Yeah. So
yes.
I'll go ahead, Sharif.
Yes. Basically, we want better strategy for Ukraine from around the world. Even for developing world, Ukraine is a model for us right now because a lot of problem happening inside Ukraine. But if we can successful in Ukraine, maybe we can share this model other developing worlds, those who face same kind of problem. So what you want to add?
Well, I totally agree with all the panelists so far, and I think again, Rob's idea with you, Sharif, to present this topic is timely and critical. Um, there's no doubt, as Edward said, he mentioned the fact that he used the example of post World War II, that there was the Marshall Plan, not named after me, obviously, but named after General George Marshall. And by the way, how was the Marshall Plan paid for? I don't know if many people know that, but it was paid for by U.S. bondholders during the war. My parents were in World War II. My father was in the Navy, and he was a Canadian who became a U.S. citizen and joined the Navy. And he was head of a unit called Special Devices, which was kind of like the Q for James Bond. And he developed a lot of things. But what he did is he always bought war bonds during the war. Our whole family did. And then post World War II, we began to buy these U.S. bonds, savings bonds, and those were used to bring back Europe and Japan, by the way, and Asia from the brink of destruction post World War II. So, and it was then that we saw the development of the infrastructure that we have today in the first world, and in parts of the developing world. And of course, the emphasis was on oil and gas and coal, because that accelerated development and technology and energy. Energy is the underlying thing, I would say, underlying piece of technology that is going to affect everybody here. Now, one of the things that we're seeing out of Ukraine and Russia with this war, and it is a war, not a military incursion, is that there's three items that I would bring to the table right now for this point of discussion. One is there's cultural differences even between the Russians and the Ukrainians. How do we know this? There are many people that live in Ukraine who are married to Russians, and people in Russia that are married to Ukrainians and Belarusians and other people throughout the area. Yet we have families that are divided because of as I think David pointed out, not David, as Edward pointed out, there's a lot of difference in terms of capability. Somebody should mute themselves. I don't know. I'm hearing some very strange noises. Anyway, what we're seeing here is a confluence of interesting classical Nazi-like, fascist-like dictatorship in Russia evolving. And people want to know, why did that come about? How come after post-World War II, Edward and his compatriots weren't able to turn around Russia as he was able to do in the Baltic republics? And I think, along with those people, a lot of that has to do with cultural attitudes and history. The Russian people have always looked to the motherland. Stalin is very well known for having done that, Lenin prior to him. And prior to that, the czars. So we have a long history of dictatorship, and it's hard to get that out of the DNA of the cultural DNA of that country. So how are you going to do that? I think we need to look towards Ukraine to help us do that. Ukraine has a lot of connections to the Russia, both culturally, but at the same time, it has a democratic basis for its structure. And I think that what Rob and Edward pointed out were really critical to what's going on. The final thing that I'd have to say here at this point in time on this discussion is that right now, the war is not over. And until the war is over, you're not going to know how you're going to really be able to help. But you got to plan anyway. There's an old expression in the military, hope for the best, plan for the worst. So I think we need to do that. I think the allies in terms of NATO countries and Western countries and developing countries who are allies of the West are in alignment that they want to see greater democracy, greater freedom, and less subjugation of a people. We've had that already in the 20th century. We're having that right now in the 21st century. We don't need any more of that. We've got two existential threats facing us right now. The first one we just heard today actually is nuclear weapons that could be deployed at tactical levels. The North Koreans are talking about that and announced that today. Putin announced that several days back that he's threatening people with nuclear weapons. So I think the thing that we got to think is if we get beyond that, the next existential threat is the climate crisis, and actually Ukraine has a big role to play along with the developing world. How do I get to that? Very simple. The developing world has a lot of resources, can grow food. There's going to be a food crisis, but it's all our food is based upon the oil and gas paradigm. We need to shift to a renewable energy paradigm. It's not going to happen overnight, but we can do it, and it can be done quickly. And I think that the opportunity, once Ukraine is freed from the Russian dictatorship, I think what we can do is we can see them be able to come back and start their economy like the EU committed to in March of 2020, which is to create a circular economy. And that will actually enhance the livelihoods of the people in Ukraine. It will make a resurgence. Edward pointed out the fact about using, or it was Rob that pointed out using the fact that you can build buildings now with 3D printing, but you can also sequester carbon in these buildings by making charcrete and things like that. There's a lot of things that can be done that exist now, and we need to do it. And guess what? The developing world can play a leading role in that, because it's my belief that countries like Malaysia and Bangladesh and India and these these developing world countries can ramp up their capability to provide these supplies back to Ukraine, where Ukraine can then get back on the road of developing the food security that it once had that came out of that. A lot of the wheat comes out of the Ukraine. A lot of the food is going to be destroyed. It's going to cause a food crisis right now. And it's not only food, but climate crisis. It's all tied together. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Talib, what you want to add, especially for this rebuilding Ukraine issue? And if you have different opinion from Middle East, we are happy to learn from you.
Thank you so much. I want to project a different perspective on all of this, perspective from the Middle East and from the developing world. Ukraine has been an example. It's opened our eyes on double standards that Europe and the West are applying. Why Ukraine now? Why not when, Americans bombed Iraq or Afghanistan, or when they broke in Hiroshima, Nagasaki? Why that now? I think the Europeans have a lot to answer to. I'm sorry to say that, but I'm not convinced that the Ukraine situation is different from that of Iraq or Afghanistan. I'm not convinced at all. I reflect their opinion. Many people in the streets here that have looked at Ukraine as an opportunity, especially people in Palestine and the Israelis are doing what they're doing. I'm sorry to say this. I know I'm disappointing many people there. I'm for the people of Ukraine. I'm all with them. But I'm not with them when it comes to single them out and not including anybody else in this. That's the developing world now. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Professor David Smith, thank you for joining today's session. What you want to add for today's discussion? I know you are expert for strategy development. You are expert for public-private partnership. How we can help Ukraine and what type of strategy we can develop for them.
Well, Sharif, thank you. I was fortunate over the weekend. I had a Slack discussion with part of my development team that we have in Ukraine. And they said, yes, the conditions are bad there. But what to me is interesting, I asked them, what do they see happening? And I can tell you from a technology standpoint, Ukraine has excellent technologists, particularly in software development. And one of the challenges with working with Ukraine was actually some of the government regulations, particularly about writing contracts and moving money into and out of the country. And they believe that one of the results of this conflict is those regulations will go away. And that because of what we see on the world stage, it will become a more open view of doing business and being out there. Now, I agree with a lot of what Rob and Marshall said as you're going forward. Uh, I think that you will see an influx of uh, money to help rebuild. Uh, the likelihood of getting Russia to pay for that with their weakening economy, I think, is going lower and lower all the time with that. So I think it will be different than what we saw at the end of World War II with Germany helping rebuild and some of those differences. Um, what I'm also seeing, though, is that the conflict, the war in Ukraine, is forcing them and their partners to look at new ways of doing partnerships, much different than they had done them in the past. Um, Probably a little bit less red tape, and that is probably good because of the rapid speed they're going to need to rebuild. Um, but let's talk about a couple of the plus sides of this as they come out of the war. And I actually agree with what was said. I believe Russia will end up annexing part of the country so that Putin can declare some type of victory. But what happened to Germany after the war? What happened to Japan after World War II? Uh, they began to be able to leapfrog old legacy technology and upgrade to some of the newest technology without regards for legacy technology because the legacy technology was destroyed. I think in many sectors in Ukraine, you're going to see that happening. You know, a large percentage of their manufacturing capabilities have been destroyed in rocket attacks. You're going to see them leapfrog the technology in manufacturing. You're going to see them leapfrog that in part of their communications infrastructure. Uh, we know that beginning last week, Russia was targeting their industry processes. They were targeting their communications infrastructure, their banking infrastructure. And all of those are going to be able to, when this war ends, again, be able to leapfrog where they were up to some of the latest and best technologies and processes. Because processes going back when you can do almost a clean slate rebuild are equally important as the new technology. Um, Other positives coming out of the war for Ukraine is that they now have a much larger place on the world stage at the end of the war than they had before. Ukraine was always a very interesting country, very high in science, very high in engineering. And it kind of shows. As Marshall said, their agriculture industry was part of the food basket for Europe and part of the rest of the world. Uh, that's going to be slower to recover. But again, I think you will see an influx of technology there, which will actually speed that up versus the methods they had used before. Um, Now, I don't want us to lose sight from a strategic view that the war in Ukraine and the indiscriminate attacks from Russia have created intense hardships. Any war creates hardships, whether it's being led uh, internally as civil wars as we see around, whether it is being a world power led attack. And unfortunately, the nature of war, uh, even though the technology has changed, the nature of war has stayed the same for a long time. and you begin to see that and understand that. I made a comment on last Friday that Thursday I was in a meeting and talking with the former four-star general, the commandant of the U.S. Marine Corps, and his comment on the strategy going forward is that with the amount of destruction you're seeing in Ukraine, Ukraine has the opportunity to take their culture and do a technology rebirth and to take it and begin to establish. The success they've had is surprising the world, but their success is because of the ingenuity of the Ukraine populace and how the rest of the world has rallied around them in giving them tools to use. I think from a strategic perspective, that has nothing but helped their prospects for a more rapid rebound after the war. And the fact that they can leapfrog so many of these technology areas. I'm in Chicago today, at an international conference in healthcare, and there's actually a couple of Ukraine doctors here and a couple of Ukraine medical device companies. So they still are able to come and participate on the world stage again, even though there is a war going on there. And their comments last night was that they see a bright future because of how they've been able to pull some of the best minds from the rest of the world to help them in the war and giving them advice on how to continue after the war. So Rob, thank you for helping pick this topic with Sharif. But I believe their strategic intent after the war will be one where you'll see them rebound faster than we saw in some of the other countries where they did not have the immense international support that like you see in Ukraine. So Sharif, thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for your excellent analysis. Professor Rob, what do you think? Because already we are observing, maybe even Russia also said the third world war is starting. What do you think? Is it true, or it take more time, or actually how we can control the situation?
Well, when you say we control, the person that's currently controlling the situation is Putin. He's driving it, and at this particular point in time, it doesn't appear that there's anybody in Russia that has, or certainly not outside of Russia, that can corral him. It is showcasing a series of things. It's showcasing that the UN really isn't doing the job it was created to do. It's showcasing really bad practice with regard to government blackmail. The reason NATO isn't entering this conflict more aggressively is because of Russian threats of nuclear retaliation. But that's generally a mistake in terms of strategy, a bluff or not. When you give in to somebody that makes a threat like that, they basically own you because they've defined the line that you will not cross. And no organization should ever let an opponent define the line that they will not cross. It's bad for negotiations, and it's certainly bad for warfare. And I think we saw that with Chamberlain and the Second World War and Hitler in terms of letting Germany at that time define the line that England wouldn't cross. And while it could be argued it did give England time to build up their military structure and create a stronger defense, it also created fairly severe problems for Chamberlain, and clearly the countries that were lost in the interim were also problematic to the effort. In this instance, I do believe that NATO made a mistake by not entering on the side of Ukraine aggressively, and at first that allows the initial battles to occur on Ukraine soil where they were going to occur anyway, and more degrade the Russian troops and forces. than they already have been degraded, and make sure that they didn't make it into NATO territory. Whereas right now, there's still a pretty good chance this war is going to expand and move into to NATO territory at some particular point, and that could have been avoided. So I think the nature here is at some point we have to relook at our structures. NATO isn't working the way it's really supposed to work in terms of a protection. The United Nations is clearly not working and effective at stopping this conflict. And the post-mortem on this conflict should address both those issues, because a world war, particularly a world war with the threat of nuclear weapons, should be something that remains intolerable to the planet, because the risk of creating a crisis that could permanently damage the planet and our ability to live on it is now fairly significant, and also something we shouldn't be tolerating as a race. Going back to rebuilding Ukraine, the rethinking the defensive posture of Europe now becomes something that needs to be thoroughly considered. Democracy has been in decline in Europe for a while now, and that's part of what's contributing to the problem that we have with regard to responding to Russia definitively. They clearly have partners in other dictatorships, and that's creating an ongoing problem, and not one that the citizens of the countries those dictators rule are necessarily in favor of, because it's the nature of a dictatorship. It's a government not at the will of the people, but despite the people. And again, that should be something that the planet is able, at least the civilization is able to counter, and currently is not in a position to do so. So in the end, I think this is showcasing the weakness of structures that were put in place largely as a result of the Second World War, and that they are inadequate to the task that they've been put to, and that aspect of the problem needs to be addressed so that those structures can fulfill their role and keep us from going to a nuclear world war, where they are unable to do so right now. I do believe we are in World War III. It's a proxy war at this point in Ukraine, but to argue that most of the world is not in some way engaged in this war, either as a victim of it in terms of logistics, or as an active participant, either in combat or providing weapons for combat, that's the world we're in right now, and that would indicate we are in a world war. It just happens to be in a proxy form at this moment, where the world's militaries aren't yet engaged, but clearly the world's economics are engaged, both through sanctions and through military supplies at an unprecedented level, I might add. The amount of financial and military help being provided to Ukraine is both unprecedented and probably inadequate, which I think is also kind of interesting. And the weapon systems that are making the biggest difference aren't the really expensive weapon systems and the high cost weapon systems. It is the drones, particularly the autonomous drones that are playing a very significant role here, along with the javelins and a number of the ground-to-air handheld weapons that have been deployed in the country. But as of right now, the major weapon systems, we don't have modern tanks against modern tanks. We don't have modern artillery against modern artillery. It is a very asymmetric battle, and it's showcasing the advantages of some of these less expensive but somewhat more intelligent weapon systems in order to provide defense. And I think as we think about as Ukraine thinks about rebuilding, and as the world thinks about structuring itself against threats like this, thinking through that's going to have major implications with not only what militaries are made up with, but also how we build communities and cities in areas of conflict to make sure they're designed to defend against both traditional and non-traditional weapon sources. And of course the big concern is we are really rushing headlong into using AI-based weapon systems very aggressively And just as nuclear power and nuclear weapons got out of hand, there's every likelihood that artificial intelligence-driven weapons are going to get out of hand and create the next big world crisis, particularly if any of these things are centrally controlled and suddenly decide to go rogue. A lot of these autonomous weapon systems, their ability to acquire and react to targets is not defined by which side you're on. It's defined by whoever controlled it, whoever programmed it, and there is a Russian concern that is a valid concern, which is if these weapon systems make it into groups that are terrorist groups, they could do a significant amount of damage to command and control and to people feeling safe and secure, well away from Ukraine. And so so we've got a number of issues we're not only going to be dealing with after this conflict is over. The really interesting thing, though, is how, at least to me, is how this has degraded interest in Russian supplied weapon systems. They have underperformed massively in this conflict, and Russia was the country that was bringing forth weapon systems that were kind of, hey, they're good enough and they're cheap. Well, this conflict is showing they're not good enough, and so cheap does not do you any good whatsoever if the weapon systems don't function. And so Russia's position in the world now, economically, through the sanctions, and then geopolitically through their weapons supply programs, has been, I would argue, critically degraded, and the amount of damage that's been done to that country is significant, which does create a much bigger long-term problem, because a country with nuclear weapons that's on its heels, like Russia is and is increasingly going to be, is going to have leadership that becomes desperate, and desperate leadership and nuclear weapons are not a good combination. So it may be time to seriously consider bringing in much more robust anti-missile systems like Israel's, like the one deployed in Israel, the Iron Dome system, and sequester Russia more aggressively. So a mistake, a desperate politician or military commander does not release nuclear weapons in an unplanned state, and then we'll truly be in World War III with significant ecological and human damage. So it's dire. It's getting more dire as we continue. And as I said, the one clear thing is the mechanisms we have to prevent this kind of problem are fundamentally not working right now, and that needs to be fixed, or we're in real trouble.
Thank you, Professor Rob. Mr. Marshall, what do you think? Professor Rob actually gave very good explanation what's happening, what next we can take. Again, the questions to you. Mr. Marshall, are you with me? Mr. Marshall?
Instead of unmuting, he turned his camera off.
Yes.
There he is. No.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
There you are.
Sorry about
Yes.
that.
It's okay.
Yes. Now, are
I'm
you
not
in
yet-
Ukraine or you are in USA?
I'm actually in a bunker in the Ukraine. That's why it's not working.
Okay. Okay.
Just
okay.
kidding. I'm just kidding.
Okay.
I'm not.
Okay.
I'm actually in the
Okay.
United States. So,
Okay.
so to answer your question, Sharif, and I think Rob made some really good points. We're still in a war setting right now, and I think that the type of weapon systems, and I think what I take a bit of a different point of view than Rob did about the fact that NATO was ineffective against the Putin. The question is in a bluff. It's one thing if you don't have nuclear weapons and you don't know if they do have them. We do know that the Russians do have nuclear weapons, and they have significant amount of them. In fact, they have more than the United States. I think they have 3 times the amount, if I remember correctly. Maybe David or Rob can correct me on that particular point. But they do have a lot more nuclear weapons than we do. Now, guessing what Putin is going to do, I think, is a dangerous game. Anybody that thinks that when Putin says he's going to use them and not take them seriously and think it's only a bluff, I think is a dangerous game. I think that the real issue here is that Putin has done things in the past. Anybody knows his past. He was a mid-level KGB agent at the end of the Cold War. And he was completely freaked out when he was in, by the way, East Germany, deployed in East Germany at the time when the wall came down. And I think one of the things that we need to think about Putin, as much as the Ukraine, We want to support the Ukrainians, absolutely. But for to say that the NATO made a mistake, maybe they did. Only history will tell at the end of the day. But if my opinion is, I think they erred on the side of caution. Maybe that is a mistake. But nuclear weapons are not something to be trifled with. Anybody that has seen it, my parents saw it during World War II with the deployment of the first nuclear weapons over Japan. And look what happened to Japan. So I think that, and those were small nuclear weapons. A tactical nuclear weapon today is what was deployed in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So what are you going to do? You're going to wipe out, to save everybody's save face. You're going to not call it. You're going to cause bluff. I think that's a dangerous, critical. I think you're threading a needle here. And I think what needs to be done is exactly what the United States is now doing, along with the the European and NATO allies, along with the third world that supports them, is that they're starting to ramp up and give them their supplies they need. The Ukrainian people have shown that they're not going to put up with a dictator. They've had it. They're not going to be subjugated. And I think what we're going to see is like what happened in World War II. This is more like a World War II conflict than a Vietnam conflict or something like that. Here, the people, or even the Middle East, this is more like World War II. The Ukrainians don't want to be subjugated by the Russians. The Russian, under a dictator, Putin, let's call it what it is subjugating his people. He's brainwashing them with their stuff, and we don't even know if what they say they believe is really what they believe. I saw just the other day the show on Navalny, Putin's dictator's nemesis, who he poisoned with Novichok. They said it wasn't Novichok. They claimed it was something else. He got back to Germany. They cleaned up his system. He stayed, and then he went back to Russia. Now, a lot of people said that was a stupid thing to do, but he did it because he did it for his principles that he stood for, and he's willing to give his life for that. And where's Navalny now? He's in a prison. And Putin's got a problem now. If he kills them, then it really exposes to the rest of the world. There are a lot of Russians that support Navalny, but they're not talking because they're subjugated. I think that we need, in my opinion, to tread carefully, but at the same time, we need to do what I think Churchill did against the Nazis, not what his predecessor did against the Nazis, which is stand up to Putin and say to him, we're not putting up with your insanity. We're not going to, and it is insanity, by the way. It's a form of a personality disorder. It's a narcissistic personality disorder. It's in the SDM. I'm sorry, the Diagnostic Service Manual, the DSM, and he has a narcissistic personality disorder. So did Stalin, and so did Hitler. So these are the types of people that are attempting to run the world. If we let them run the world, we're all gone. You can kiss yourself goodbye if that happens. So I think, yes, we have to stand up against them, but we have to thread a very careful a way to do this, because I think there's more than one way to skin the cat, as they say in the United States, with regard to Putin. Yes, we have to support the Ukrainians. We have to make sure that they fight the good fight, and that if he crosses the line, then he'll be taking on NATO. I have no doubt about that. NATO has made that very clear to him. And I think that's he's got a problem. And as a narcissistic personality disorder, he doesn't think the way that everybody that's watching this mostly thinks, unless they have that disorder. And his point of view is only me, I. What matters to me counts. He doesn't give one iota of care about his people, how many soldiers he kills. We know that there are a lot of Russian soldiers that he's not burying their bodies. He's not telling the parents where they are. He doesn't care, and he will never care. So dealing with somebody like that, you have to take a special tack, an approach to deal with a personality disorder like that. And if you don't, then woe is us. I have no doubt that he would pull the trigger, because I don't think he cares about Rob or you or me or any of the people watching this show. I think what he cares about is himself, and that's it, and his own grandiosity, and that's what it comes down to. So are there political implications? Are there technology implications? Are there other existential threats? Yes, there are. We got to get rid of him and make sure he's not replaced with another narcissistic personality disorder person. But it's going to be hard because in that culture, it lends itself towards the great father figure, like Stalin, like a Hitler type, like a Putin type. So I'm not sure that we have the answers to that, but I do know one thing. I do agree with Rob on this phase. We need to stand up to him and not take his BS, and that's my take.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Marshall, for your excellent contribution. Professor Talib, my next question to you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes. Professor, who can stop Putin? You can call Mr. Putin on behalf of us, and you can, because you are very influential political leader. On behalf of us, you can call Mr. Putin and you can stop him. Or who is the political leader who can stop actually Putin right now? What is your view?
Only Putin himself.
Okay.
Only Putin himself.
Okay. But in previously in the global arena, we saw when this kind of crisis come, naturally different country, political leader like you, they play a role to convince political leaders. Maybe you have more capacity than us because we are very simple people. You have a political background and you have transparent background. So this is our request from on behalf of World Talent Economy Forum. You can play this role, or you can invite other political leaders, those who are good friend of Mr. Putin, and they can stop him. What do you think? Is it practically possible, or what your view?
It is very possible. It's very possible.
Yeah.
Very possible.
Yes.
Because Putin is not what Mr. Marshall has said about him. Putin is a person that cares about his country. We should appeal to that part. We should appeal to the part that says that he is in favor of his interest, the country's interest.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor. Professor David Smith, what do you think? As a negotiator, we can use the expertise of Dr. Talib Raphael and this kind of political person who can convince and stop this war. What do you think?
Well, I'm excited to see parts of the Western world pulling together to help, not only help Ukraine, but begin to send messages to Putin. What I'm a little disappointed in is that some other parts of the world, some of folks in the Southern Hemisphere, and actually part of the whole Asia environment has not stepped up more fully to help communicate the messages to Putin. I agree with that in the past, many nations have made mistakes as we've looked at conflicts around the globe. The United States made conflicts, Russia made conflicts. Going back in the past, UK made mistakes. Going back to the Roman era, the Romans made mistakes going around the world. And hopefully we're learning from each of those as we go forward. I agree with Talib that inside Russia, only Putin or a citizen uprising can change this. I don't see the citizen uprising happening because of how he is using his KGB skills to control the press, to control the public perception, and the fact that he's beginning to do things. I was in a discussion earlier with some people about the Russia now beginning to disconnect from the public internet and create what is called a splinter network. If Russia continues to do that and further isolates itself from the internet that the rest of the world uses, then it will create even more of the gap between what we can do with Putin and with the Russian people versus the rest of the world. And that will be an unfortunate fallout of this. We as a species are very good about handling disruption and rebuilding from disruption. In Ukraine's perspective, we have already resources that are being deployed there. Rob mentioned 3D printing earlier. We know that Western nations have already sent a fair amount of small scale 3D printing into Ukraine to help repair, rebuild things, particularly after their factories are being destroyed. So we're seeing that. The other thing that is gratifying to me is that we've broken many of the rules of non-transparency because of the war in Ukraine. The Western nations, particularly the Five Eyes, are sharing a lot more information with Ukraine. I am, as someone who has done work in the intelligence community, I am surprised to see the amount of information, for example, that the United States has shared leading up to the invasion and since the invasion, exposing some of our means and methods of the intelligence process. But that has been nothing but helping to shine a spotlight on what's happening. My fear on this part of it, Sharif, is that we see a lot of leadership being killed inside of Ukraine. And that is going to be a challenge with rebuilding. I do think, though, if we see all of Ukraine taken over, that the Russian government will not stop at the border. I think we will see them go ahead and move to Finland and to Sweden as well.
Thank you, Professor David Smith, Professor Rob, Mr. Marshall, and Dr. Talib Raphael for joining today's discussion. Today's discussion is very, very important. At present situation, we do not want war. We do not want to see any people died. Everywhere, it's in Ukraine, Middle East, Asia, Africa, everywhere. We should stop war. And maybe we have many political influential leaders, those who can convince this political leader, especially Dr. Talib Raphael, how he has a global influence on behalf of us. I'm sure all of our speakers, our fellow, our board of advisors, we have around 300 fellow from around the world, more than 100 countries. They are very influential in their corporate career, academic career, and political careers. With all of your support, maybe we can develop a history, and World Talent Economy Forum want to take this kind of initiative. If personally I request Dr. Talib, if this kind of negotiator help us, I'm sure at least we can try to stop this war. Beside that, we get very important strategy. So I believe the developing world, they can take better strategy because many countries feeling insecure in this situation after COVID, then this war. So we need better strategy from the government. We have expert panelists, Professor Rob, Mr. Marshall, Professor David Smith, those who can help the developing world. And beside that, I request everyone, because World Talent Economy Forum, we are actually developing our book. This book is based on the economic of talent management and human capitals. IGI Global, it's a very good publisher, Scopus Index. They have already many young people. They are actually working with World Talent Economy Forum. They are developing research paper. Beside that, I request all of our board of advisors, those who work with World Talent Economy Forum, I want to invite you all in our editorial panel, our reviewer panel, because it will be very interesting project for human development. So So I want to give a special thanks to IGI publishers. So hopefully with all of your contributions, it will be very, very interesting book on behalf of World Talent Economy Forum. I work as a chief editor. Already we invite from academy, Professor Adrian David Chiox, Professor Thomas, and beside that, Professor Rob, Professor David Smith, Mr. Marshall, everyone I want to invite because we need a very big teams. At least we need 30 reviewer for review different chapters and review different article. 100 of people from developing world, they are researcher, pure researcher, those who doing research on talent economy development. So through this process we can develop better policy, better knowledge oriented society. Thank you, Professor Rob, Mr. Marshall, and David Smith for your continuous support for World Talent Economy Forum. And I request all of our audience, please share our content as much as possible with your government, with your corporation, and with your academy. Thank you, bye bye, and take care.